faint moonlight lit the cell, casting it in a murky gloom. Thaelen sat on the floor, his back against the wall. It was still the small hours, and the barracks were largely quiet. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. It had now been 2 days since she had tapped on the window. What was Taela planning? Whatever it was, it had to happen soon. By late afternoon, the gallows were waiting. He knew that a priest would soon arrive to give him the last rite, to commend his soul to the care of Hennith. It was always performed before Eliva rose, in the shadows of the night. There were voices coming from outside the heavy wooden door, and soon it was unlocked. 2 people emerged into the cell. The first was a priest clad in grey robes. He was tall, with dark brown hair. The other was a priestess, the same priestess from the temple. Her blonde hair, which had been braided before, was now unbraided. She was holding a bag, and from it produced a goblet of silver, as well as a small bottle of wine. These she placed on the small table. She also produced a smaller bottle with some kind of blue, faintly glowing liquid within it, but only after the other priest had turned his back towards her. The priest came up towards Thaelen. His expression was solemn. "Is everything prepared, Anea?" he asked. "It is." He nodded. "Let's begin then. August, Hennith, and Orothos, rulers of the dead, I call upon you." The priest spoke the words calmly, yet with a deep power. "Guide this soul, who delivered into your care soon shall be. Send your daughter Cathene to guide him to your realm, and in your land let him rest, in your land let him heal from mortality, heal from the curse of the Black Blade." As the priest fell silent, the priestess brought forth the goblet. He took it and brought it to his lips, then gave the goblet to Thaelen. But before Thaelen could drink from it, the priest collapsed, the priestess catching him before he fell to the floor. She lowered and laid him down. She then produced a key from her robe and came over to Thaelen, and as quietly as she could, unlocked the cuffs around his wrists. "Put on his robes," she whispered. "What?" Thaelen asked, confused. "What are you doing?" The priestess put her finger to her lips. "Shh! Play along! His robes!" "All right," he whispered. Thaelen bent down. The priest was still alive, but asleep. He undid the robes and draped the garment over himself, then pulled up the hood taking care to hide his hair as best as he could. He then gave the priestess a questioning look. "Now what?" "Help me move him to the bed." Silently, they lifted the sleeping priest onto the bed, draping the bed's rough linen blanket over him. "The gloom of the cell should hide the fact that it isn't you. I hope." She turned to face Thaelen, helping him to tie the sash of the robes properly. "The priests of Henneth are to remain silent for an hour after the final rite. So you don't have to say anything. Just follow along and let me do the talking, okay?" "Right, okay," Thaelen whispered, nodding. "As long as you keep your head down and remain silent, we shouldn't have any trouble." He nodded again. Anea looked at the figure laying on the bed. "Sorry, Vern." She gazed towards the window. As Thaelen followed her gaze, he could see that a falcon was perched there. The bird took off. The priestess gathered up the goblet and bottles, then went to the door and knocked. The guard opened and gazed at them. "You're done?" "We are." "All right," he said, stepping aside to let them pass. They emerged into a long corridor. Cells with sturdy wooden doors were found on either side of its length. Once they were outside of the cell, the guard closed the door again, locking it. "Everything went all right in there? He seemed very quiet." "Few are happy being passed on to their care," Anea answered. He wanted to try and rest before the end." "I'm gonna be honest with you, priestess. I pity him. But laws are laws." Anea smiled, a sad smile. "May the gods watch over you." Then they left the guard behind, walking along the corridor towards a set of stairs at its end. The spiral staircase went down for quite some time, but at last they came out into another corridor, which led into a room. Several guards stood along the walls, ready to pounce if needed. Thaelen kept his head down. He tried to control his breathing, but it was hard to stay calm. He could hear his own pulse, and his throat seemed parched. The room beyond the corridor was the entrance hall of the barracks, and just beyond it lay freedom. Just before they reached the end of the corridor, there was a sudden bell that rang. Thaelen froze. His muscles refused to respond. They had been discovered. Soon the guards would be on them. He looked towards the priestess, but she remained calm. A cry came from outside. "The other mage! She is here!" The guards rushed down the corridor, past Anea and Thaelen. They pressed themselves towards the wall, as to be out of the way for the hurrying guards. Then they continued into the room. Many guards were on the move. The young guard, the one with a scar that had caught Thaelen, was directing them. What's going on, brother? Anea asked, feigning surprise. It seems the other mage is attempting some kind of ill-mannered jailbreak, he answered. Nelran, a guard called. What are we to do? Don't just stand there, Gareth. After her. But what about you, Nelran? I need to make sure my sister is safe. Until I or the captain return. You are in command, okay? The guard saluted him. Aye, Nelran. He then began to direct the others, barking out orders. Nelran then turned back towards the pair. Until it is safe to leave, you two are staying here in the barracks, he said. Come with me. He led them down a side corridor, took a flight of stairs down, and into another corridor. Thaelen once more felt panic rising. What were they going to do? He looked at the priestess again, but just as before, she seemed calm and collected. The guard stopped and looked about. There were no one else present. He sighed. The dream leaf worked, then. He asked quietly. Like a dream, brother, she answered. Relief washed over Thaelen, who let out a long sigh. The guard nodded, then indicated with his head. This way. He continued down the corridor, stopping at a door some distance down it. He produced a set of keys and unlocked it. Beyond was a storeroom. Several chests and shelves stood along the walls. He went over to one of the chests in the far end and unlocked it. As he opened it, the sight of Isti Agniem's handle met Thaelen's eyes. The gilding of the leaf-like crossguard glinted before him. Well, what are you waiting for, mage? Grab it so we can get out of here. Thaelen collected his items. He removed the robes and put on his own clothes in haste. Once he was finished, Nelren led them out of the room and down the corridor to another room. He ushered them in and closed the door behind them. The room beyond was another storeroom. A gloom filled it. A single lantern was lit, and no other light was present. Rows of chests and barrels stood along the walls, and many were placed in the center of the room as well. In the far end was a sealed metal door. Nelren led them towards it, but just before he was to unlock it, there came a sound from behind them. They turned to see that the door into the room had been opened, and a guard was standing on the threshold. Nelren, we need you! What? The guard stopped mid-sentence. He was the same guard that Nelren had given command to. For a moment they stood watching one another. Then the guard opened his mouth to yell, but he froze, his eyes darting from side to side in sudden panic. Thaelen's hands were outstretched. They were trembling. The siblings gazed first at the guard, then at Thaelen. bind him or something, he said with an effort. I can't keep him like this forever. With what? Anea asked. I don't know, figure something out, Thaelen said, trying to keep focus. Well, I still have some dream leaf, Anea said, and produced the small bottle once more from the bag. She walked up to the guard. His eyes were fixed on her. She gently pressed the bottle against his lips. Forgive me, she said as she poured the remaining liquid down his throat. His eyes were still fixed on her, but swiftly thereafter they closed. Thaelen let go of the spell. Anea caught the guard as he fell, and with Nelwyn's help dragged him into the room. You, she said. You froze him. Thaelen had collapsed against the wall, panting. His hands were shaking. He nodded. Are you all right? She asked. It's taxing. We'll have to hurry, Nelwyn said, indifferent. They will notice that he is gone. Nelwyn unlocked the metal door and opened it. Thaelen heaved himself towards it, still leaning against the wall. He almost barfed. A pungent smell wafted from the opening. It was not a pleasant one. Oh, where does this go? Out, Nelwyn answered. He ushered them in and closed the door behind them. A short corridor led to another door, which Nelwyn unlocked and opened as well. Thaelen heard the sound of rushing water, and the smell grew stronger. They entered the new space. It was pitch black. From the smell, Thaelen guessed they had entered the sewers. The guard struck a match against the wall and lit a lantern. He gave the lantern to the priestess. From his bag he produced a map detailing the city's sewers. It was an old map of the city, from before the fires, and the sewers went under the middle walls, out into the outer circle. A red line had been drawn following a specific tunnel. After having studied the map for a second, Nelwyn said, "Let's go," and promptly started down a tunnel. As they walked, Thaelen couldn't help but gaze at the masonry. The bricks were cut and placed with acute perfection, and no hint was to be found of the mortar in between the stones. The tunnel was 2 meters wide and 2 meters tall at the highest point of its arched ceiling. Cutting through the middle was an open duct where murky water flowed at a rather fast pace. Side tunnels passed through the passage at regular intervals, collecting more sewage into the duct. There were few sounds beside their footsteps, though the squeak of a rat could be heard from time to time. Silence lay upon them, and for several minutes none spoke. Then at last Thaelen broke the silence. "Thank you, both of you. It wouldn't have been right to leave you there," the priestess said. The guard was silent for a second, then said, "Do not think I am doing this for you, mage. Had you been anyone else, I wouldn't have cared. But your execution could have sparked a war, and I will not see the people of Daria suffer." Thaelen looked down, nodding his head. "I am also doing it for her," Nelren continued, indicating his sister. Thaelen looked at the priestess, an eyebrow raised. I can't remain in the city, or Daria as a whole, for that matter. And since you are after a divine artifact, I, as a representative of the gods, am coming along to make sure you don't do anything bad with it." "So am I," the guard said, a tone of annoyance playing in his voice. "I guess that Taela has told you of our mission, then." She disclosed a brief overview. "Humor me, mage," Nelren said, looking over his shoulder. "But for what reason are mages searching for Nuvia's bow? Power? Ambition? Safekeeping?" Thaelen answered. "Some nefarious group have been searching for information on it. Several documents have been stolen from temples throughout Elrin, and several experts on divine artifacts have been kidnapped, and some have been found dead. A lingering touch of necrotic magic found on all bodies. The guild, under His Majesty's orders, have been looking into these occurrences. Me and Taela were sent to find the Starbow before this group." "But why Dayroll?" Anea asked. "The only member of our order that did any substantial research on the bow's whereabouts was Helthir. His trip to this city was to find information on the subject. We hoped to figure out where he went next." "And did you?" He nodded. "We did. Anshira." "Marvelous," Nelren began. "We are going to the heart of slavery in northern Edera." Silence fell between them. For several minutes they walked as such. They passed by an opening on their right, and Thaelen gazed down it. In the gloom, beyond the light of the lantern, he saw a person, a woman clad in grey, holding what seemed like an unlit lantern. He stopped and gazed at the figure. "What is it?" Anea asked. He looked over at the priestess. "There's someone," he said, gazing back into the passage. The woman was gone. Anea and Nelren looked down the passage as well, the light of the lantern illuminating the tunnel. A rat scurried away from the sudden brightness, but otherwise there was no life there. There were no side passages, and it went on for quite a while. No person could have hidden within its length. I could have sworn. Shadows playing tricks, Anea said. Let's not linger. Criminals, Nelren said, pausing for a moment as he looked at Thaelen. Criminals use these tunnels from time to time. They continued, but Thaelen couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He was sure that he had seen someone. From time to time he thought he heard footsteps behind them, but whenever he turned to look, there were none present. At least not that he could see within the flickering light of the lantern. Eventually Nelren turned left and headed down a side passage. This they followed for a while, until they came to a small alcove. A stair had been cut into it, savagely carved through masonry and filler. They climbed the steep, rough steps and emerged into a narrow corridor. At its end was another set of stairs, leading to a wooden hatch. Nelren now extinguished the lantern, then slowly lifted the hatch. "Remain here," he said, and went up. For a short while they stood there in the dark. Maybe it was just the rushing sound of sewage, but Thaelen could have sworn that he heard voices from below. Some kind of chant or song. At last the hatch opened once more, and he and Anea climbed up. They emerged into a ruin. It was nothing more than an empty shell, a husk. It lacked a roof, and moss grew on the old stone. It was still dark outside, and all was still and silent. "Come," Nelren said. "The others are waiting in the brewery." Around the ruin were trees, a collection of elder trees and oaks. As they emerged from the shell of the building, they heard a screech coming from an old oak. Upon a branch sat an owl, barely visible in the moonlight. Its wings were brown, but its head was white. White also was its chest, with black spots strewn upon it. The bird cocked its head, its black eyes fixed on the trio. "A barn owl," Nelren said. "An ill omen." "Bring not misfortune, O Cathene, daughter of dread Henith and Orothos," Anea said, "for we mean you no offense." It screeched again and flew off. They stood there for a few seconds. Thaelen, at last, felt some peace. Perhaps it was the cool night, or the feeling of the breeze upon his face. Then at last they continued on their way, heading south towards a large building some distance away.